The town of Budgeri, Australia, may not be the first place that comes to mind when you think of shocking crime stories. With less than 200 residents and its rural location in Victoria's Gippsland region, about 2.5 hours southeast of Melbourne, it's a quiet and peaceful town. However, in the spring of 2008, Budgeri found itself in the spotlight when a crime involving two young individuals made national headlines. Let me tell you, this crime has one of the most unbelievable twists we've ever heard of. On the morning of March 4, 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buckwald and his girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, were getting ready for a picnic lunch together. This was a common activity for them since they both lived with their parents, and there wasn't much to do in the rural area they called home. Julian's family owned a massive piece of land in Budgeri, spanning over 1,200 acres and mostly covered in bushland. This meant that they had endless places to explore and enjoy nature. Despite their young age and having been together for only 2 years, Julian and Carolyn were deeply committed to their relationship. They had even discussed getting married someday and had shared this dream with their local church's pastor. Both Julian and Carolyn came from religious families, and it was at church where their paths first crossed. On that morning, Julian picked up Carolyn from her home in the nearby town of Churchill. Although Churchill was larger than Budgeri, with a population of under 5,000, it was just a short 20-minute drive away. Julian and Carolyn made their way to Julian's parents' property to gather the necessary items for their picnic before embarking on their journey. They only needed to bring food as they planned to return by 3 p.m., but they still required Julian's vehicle to reach the spot they had in mind, which was a distance away from the Buckwald's house. The location they were headed to was situated near a waterfall, and it was a place that the couple knew well. Although the drive was uneventful, Julian noticed the carcass of an animal along the road, which piqued his interest. After driving a little further, Julian found a safe spot to pull over and decided to investigate. He walked back down the road, but it was a bit of a distance, and he soon disappeared from Carolyn's sight. Carolyn, uninterested in the road, opted to wait inside the SUV. She was accustomed to Julian's tendency to get sidetracked by unusual things, and it was not uncommon for him to investigate something that caught his attention while they were exploring. However, after 10 minutes had passed with no sign of Julian, Carolyn grew worried. He had never taken this long before, and she debated whether she should leave the car to check on him. Carolyn's mind was still reeling from the situation when she noticed something that sent shivers down her spine. In one of the SUV's side view mirrors, she caught sight of a figure dressed entirely in black, wearing gloves and a balaclava. It was an unknown man, sprinting towards her car door. Before Carolyn could even process what was happening or lock the vehicle, the stranger had already opened the passenger side door and forcefully pulled her out. She fell to the ground, her mouth quickly covered with duct tape. Helplessly, she was bound and thrown into the back seat of the car, her visibility severely limited. Confused and terrified, Carolyn lay there for what felt like an eternity before realizing that the SUV was in motion. She was being driven away, with no clue as to where she was being taken. The journey seemed endless, until finally, the vehicle came to a halt. Once again, the attacker dragged Carolyn out of the car, still bound and gagged, and threw her to the ground. Already consumed by fear, Carolyn struggled to make sense of her surroundings. All she could discern was that she had been brought to a densely wooded area. Her assailant, wielding a knife, cut off her clothes, leaving her completely exposed and vulnerable. As if the situation couldn't possibly get any worse, Carolyn then heard the chilling sounds of digging nearby. Convinced that her life was hanging by a thread, she did the only thing she could think of. She began to pray, desperately hoping for a miracle. At the same time as all of this was unfolding, Julian's parents had quickly noticed the absence of the young couple. They became increasingly worried when the couple didn't arrive home at 3 p.m. that day, as it was highly unusual for them to be late. Within an hour, Julian's mother was pacing nervously around the property, constantly scanning the driveway for any sign of her son's SUV. During one of her walks, she noticed something strange protruding from the wire fence surrounding the property, a bottle with a piece of paper inside. Upon reading the note, Julian's mother was filled with dread. Although we cannot repeat the contents of the note verbatim due to its excessive profanity, we can say that it contained a warning that the couple had been taken and would only be returned if certain demands were met. The note threatened violence against the couple if the demands were not met, leaving Julian's parents in a state of panic. Julian's mother was understandably horrified when she found the note. Despite the instructions to remain calm, she immediately panicked and called the police. The authorities wasted no time in organizing a search effort, starting with the vast 1,200-acre Buckwald property. The task ahead was daunting, given the property's size and the challenging terrain of rugged bushland and hidden side roads. The pressure to find Julian and Carolyn intensified when it was discovered that Carolyn's family had also received a threatening note 10 days prior. Just like Julian's mother, Carolyn's father had found the note on their front porch, warning them to stay away or face dire consequences. Unfortunately, the police had dismissed it as a dark prank at the time, not realizing the connection between the two notes. The identical handwriting in both notes made it clear to the authorities that they were dealing with the same unknown culprit. It seemed that there was a prior connection between the perpetrators and the Buckwald and Watson families. This was puzzling, as neither family had reported having any enemies. However, there were chilling clues in the notes that hinted at a deeper motivation behind the disappearances. The notes sent to Carolyn's family revealed that the culprits considered Christians to be their enemies, suggesting a potentially disturbing motive. The two notes also contained an unusual symbol, which was later identified as the emblem of a satanic cult known as the Order of Nine Angles. Our research revealed that this group was founded in the UK during the 1960s, but it gained significant recognition in the 1980s when some of its members became known for their extreme political ideologies and activism. Since then, the Order of Nine Angles has reportedly expanded its influence to various countries worldwide. They advocate for isolation from society, embrace violence, engage in criminal activities, and even promote human sacrifice. Understandably, the mention of human sacrifice in relation to the disappearances of Julian and Carolyn attracted the most attention. Although there were no official reports of the cult's activities in Australia, many feared that the young couple might be a part of their attempt to gain notoriety in the country. The situation worsened as days passed without any sign of Julian and Carolyn. While authorities were uncertain about the involvement of the satanic cult, they were convinced that foul play was involved in the couple's disappearance, even if they hadn't been kidnapped by unknown individuals. Investigators were concerned about the couple's chances of survival in the harsh and unforgiving Australian bushland. They had no provisions other than the clothes they were wearing and the food they had brought for that day. If they were lost, they would have to endure extreme temperature changes, dangerous wildlife, and challenging terrain. Behind closed doors, the police were well aware that as time went on, the focus of the search was shifting from a rescue operation to a recovery mission. However, after 6 agonizing days, there was a glimmer of hope. The authorities were able to deliver the incredible news that everyone had been praying for. Carolyn and Julian had been found alive. They had emerged onto a road near Alpine National Park and were fortunate enough to be picked up by a passing farmer. It was no surprise that the investigators had struggled to locate them during the search. The national park was situated hundreds of miles away from where Carolyn and Julian had gone missing, making it a 6-hour car journey. Despite enduring severe sunburns, cuts, blisters, and bruises from their arduous journey through the wilderness, they were physically all right. Due to the ongoing concern over the threatening letters received by their families, the police wasted no time in interviewing Carolyn and Julian about their ordeal. Carolyn was the first to bravely recount her terrifying experience. According to her account, she found herself lying on the ground, bound and without any clothes. Despite the dire situation, she continued to pray, fully aware that her life was hanging by a thread. However, a glimmer of hope emerged when the sounds of digging ceased. It seemed as though her assailant had momentarily departed, leaving her alone. Uncertain of what to do next, Carolyn struggled against her restraints, desperately trying to free herself. Time was of the essence, as her captor could return at any moment. Fortunately, a while later she heard a sound that brought her some solace amidst the chaos. It was Julian's voice calling out to her. Julian, too, was naked and bound, but he managed to maneuver his body skillfully within his restraints, inching closer to Carolyn. Miraculously, he was able to seize the knife that had been used to strip them of their clothing, which the attacker had carelessly left behind. With Carolyn's assistance, Julian used the knife to liberate himself, and then proceeded to free her. Fearful that their assailant might reappear at any given moment, Julian and Carolyn wasted no time in assessing their surroundings. They realized they were in the midst of a desolate area. Hastily, they grabbed a discarded sleeping bag and a few food items before fleeing into the nearby woods, still completely unclothed. While exploring the woods, Julian updated Carolyn on the events she had missed when he had stopped to examine the roadkill earlier that day. He revealed that it was a trap, and as he leaned over to inspect the animal, he heard footsteps approaching before being violently struck from behind, rendering him unconscious. The blow was so powerful that Julian remained unconscious for several hours, only waking up to find himself naked and bound. He immediately called out for Carolyn. Over the next few days, they desperately searched for an escape route through the dense bushland, relying on the few supplies they had managed to steal before fleeing. The scorching daytime temperatures made survival challenging, and the nights were bitterly cold. Throughout their ordeal, they lived in constant fear of the attacker discovering them before they could find a way out. Their terror intensified when they accidentally stumbled upon the same location where they had been held captive. Despite their fear of being recaptured, Julian bravely returned to the camp and discovered some clothes in a backpack that had been left behind. Finally, after nearly a week, they successfully found their way out of the forest and reached the road where they managed to get help. When Julian was interviewed by the police, he confirmed the details that Carolyn had shared with him, excluding the parts where he was unconscious. Based on this information, investigators decided that the best approach would be to locate the place where the couple was initially taken after being kidnapped, hoping to uncover more clues. Surprisingly, they were able to accomplish just that. During the search of the site, they discovered a shovel, duct tape, pieces of rope, and the clothes that were cut off from Julian and Carolyn. However, this is where the case took a truly chilling turn. Upon analyzing the items found at the site, the police determined that all of them belonged to Julian Buckwald himself. Prior to this discovery, investigators had noticed a few inconsistencies in Julian's account of events. One major discrepancy was that the spot where he claimed to have been struck on the head and rendered unconscious showed minimal signs of any injury when questioned further. Eventually, Julian confessed to his involvement in the entire ordeal. He revealed that he had pre-planted the black clothing, balaclava, and gloves that he used to disguise himself as the attacker. He had also sent the notes to create the illusion that a cult was responsible for their subsequent disappearances. To execute his plan without raising suspicion, he fabricated a story about an animal carcass, allowing him to pull over to the side of the road. During this time, out of sight, he gathered his belongings and changed his appearance before launching his attack on Carolyn and restraining her. Upon reaching Alpine National Park, Julian dug a hole to bury incriminating evidence that could link him to the crime. This cleverly deceived Carolyn, as she mistook the sounds of him hiding the evidence for the attacker digging her grave. Furthermore, Julian concealed his vehicle in the woods to prevent their escape. Once everything was sufficiently hidden, he cut his own clothes and bound himself, pretending to have just woken up and calling out Carolyn's name. The kidnappers' puzzling decision to leave them with minimal supplies was actually Julian's way of ensuring they wouldn't starve or freeze to death. However, he deliberately kept them uncomfortable by leaving them naked, as this was crucial to his twisted plan. You see, Julian and Carolyn had differing opinions on when to get married. While Julian wanted an immediate marriage, Carolyn wished to finish school and establish their lives first. Although this disagreement may seem trivial, it posed a significant problem for Julian, who desired a sexual relationship. However, due to their strong religious beliefs, they refrained from engaging in any physical relationship until they were married. This is where Julian's twisted plan came into play. He thought that by leaving them exposed and vulnerable to the elements, and making them fear for their lives, he could manipulate Carolyn into consummating their relationship. Over the course of several days, Julian persistently brought up the subject, using various excuses to try and convince Carolyn. He even went as far as saying that since they were on the brink of death, they might as well leave the world and be married in the eyes of God. He even suggested that physical intimacy was necessary to keep them warm. However, Carolyn remained steadfast in her principles, firmly believing that God would rescue them from their predicament. As disturbing as this explanation already was, it became even more chilling when Julian confessed to investigators that he had deliberately kept them lost in the forest. He had a map of Alpine National Park hidden among their supplies, indicating that they were never truly lost. Julian had intentionally led them in circles, hoping to wear Carolyn down, all the while knowing that she genuinely believed they were being pursued by a dangerous kidnapper. Only when it became evident that Carolyn wouldn't give in and he wouldn't get what he desired did Julian finally lead them out of the forest. Following his confession, Julian faced multiple charges and was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and making a false report in August of 2009. However, Julian's story didn't quite come to an end there. Surprisingly, despite his impending sentencing, the 23-year-old managed to secure bail, allowing him to remain free until the official verdict was delivered. True to his pattern of making questionable choices, Julian made one last desperate attempt to escape just before his scheduled sentencing in September 2009. He acquired an Indian passport and boarded a flight bound for Chennai. There are conflicting reports regarding the legitimacy of the passport itself, but most sources suggest that it was indeed a genuine Indian passport that Julian later altered by adding his own photo. In preparation for the photo, Julian dyed his hair black and applied copious amounts of fake tanning solution to darken his skin, perhaps hoping to pass as an Indian. It's worth noting that Julian was naturally fair-skinned, with blue eyes and light brown hair. Although this absurd disguise managed to fool Australian airport officials, their Indian counterparts were more astute and promptly denied Julian entry into the country. Instead, he was partially sent back and subsequently apprehended by Australian authorities in Singapore. Investigators believed that India was merely a stopover in Julian's intended journey, with Germany being his ultimate destination due to his familial ties there. Ironically, despite being returned to Australia and receiving a sentence of 7 years and 3 months for the kidnapping, along with an additional 6 months for fleeing while on bail, Germany would eventually become his final destination. Julian's family moved to Australia when he was just 1 year old, but interestingly, he was actually born in Germany. Despite spending his entire life in Australia, he never bothered to obtain Australian citizenship. This oversight came back to haunt him when he was in jail in 2014, as the Immigration and Border Protection Department informed him that his permanent residency visa was being reviewed. Despite his efforts to fight against the cancellation of his visa, Julian was unsuccessful. In 2016, he was ultimately deported to Germany. This is the most recent information we have about Julian and the case as a whole. According to reports from that time, Julian only spoke English and had no German friends. Understandably, he had limited career prospects in Germany. It's definitely a strange ending to one of the wildest cases we've ever encountered. Now that you know the whole story, did you see the twist in the case coming? Is there anything you think we missed or overlooked? Let us know in the comments section below. And while you're there, if you enjoyed our video, remember to like and subscribe to True Crime Stories for more captivating true crime content like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest releases.